So please join me in welcoming tonight to Highland, Joel Skousen.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you. That's probably an old bio. There is no more print edition. Everything is by email and online now. But each World Affairs Brief comes with a PDF link. So people who want to read it on paper can simply hit, just like this gentleman has, hit the print button and you can print it out to read on paper. My specialty in the World Affairs Brief is understanding the secret agenda of secret combinations and how they deal with our government. And in 2019, if we could give a title to this year, it would be the war on Donald Trump from the deep state. Now, even though Donald Trump has succumbed to his advisors on deep state issues, probably about 60 to 70%, they still want him out of there because he keeps changing his mind. He's just not as good as a puppet. I mean, a puppet like Barack Obama or George W. Bush for the Republicans simply does what he's told. George W. Bush had no training whatsoever in politics, didn't know anything about any foreign country before he was president. He was briefed for days and days by George W. Shultz, a globalist, and his team of people until he finally declared that George W. Bush was ready. He still had to read from a prompter on everything. But George W. Bush was from the Bush family. His father, George H.W. Bush, mentioned the New World Order 100 times during his presidency. So he was a born-again globalist. His attorney general, by the way, was William Barr, who's pretending now to be a loyalist to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump believes him. Donald Trump trusts him. Donald Trump is a fool. He's probably the worst judge of people I've ever known. He replaces one deep stater with another. And part of that's not his fault. I mean, Donald Trump has never been a conservative. He doesn't know any conservatives. He was palling around with Hillary Clinton and various other people in the city of New York, which isn't exactly known for conservatives. What Donald Trump has going for him is good instincts. He seems to sense that something isn't right. And so when he when he was starting to run for president and read about the conservative agenda, things resonated with him. To that, we have to give Donald Trump credit. But you see, when you're elected president, you have 4,000 positions to fill in the White House, and you don't know anybody to fill those positions. What are you going to do? You turn to Reince Priebus of the Republican National Committee, who's an establishment Republican, a rhino Republican in name only. And so everybody that gets staffed in the White House is either deep state or mainstream Republican. So the FBI didn't have but just one spy in the White House. They have dozens of spies in the White House. And during the impeachment hearings, that came out very clear. Lieutenant Colonel Squirrely Vindman from Ukraine, as soon as he heard this telephone call with Ukraine, calls up his CIA buddy, Eric Ciaramella, and rats on Trump and says, here's an impeachable offense. But he isn't the only one. There's tens of people, maybe hundreds in the White House that are leaking constantly to the New York Times and the Washington Post. So Donald Trump has his work cut out for him. It was a very interesting article which I published in the World Affairs Brief this past Friday, actually today, about Susan Gordon, who was Deputy DNI, Director of National Intelligence under Dan Coates. And she went before the press and told about what it was like to give a briefing to Donald Trump. And she said it was very disturbing because he would often interrupt and say, I don't believe that. Or he would say, where do you get that? What's the basis for that? And she said, we've never had a president ask those kind of questions. Presidents generally just nod their head and accept the intelligence that we give. But Donald Trump questions things. Now, conservatives read that article and said, wow, that's our man. Donald Trump is saying, I don't believe it. He's challenging these, but he's not really. And the reason he isn't is because he has nothing to back it up with, except his gut feeling. I don't believe that. I don't think that's right. And what do? They bring out the backup boys. They bring out the rational explanations, and they convince Donald Trump. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. But even when it doesn't, like when they told him, you can't get out of Afghanistan, we'll have terrorists running all over the world, he stayed with his gut feeling and said, yeah, we're going to get out. I'm just tired of these foreign wars. Well, 2 months later, they talked him out of it again. And the reason is because he doesn't have the background. He doesn't have the arguments. He doesn't have any information. He doesn't know about the deep state. He doesn't know that the deep state created ISIS. He doesn't know that the deep state funded and poured in arms into Syria, as documented by Dilyana Detancheva of Romania. She went into there and found, after the Syrian government had captured some of these arms depots, started photographing those and found lots of papers and documents. U.S. State Department authoring these arms coming through Silkways airline from Azerbaijan, diplomatic baggage. Mortars and rockets are diplomatic baggage. That's what the deep state is doing. Donald Trump doesn't have a clue. Now, Mike Pompous Pompeo has a clue. He even said in an interview, jokingly, or so they said, in the CIA, we're experts at lying, and we tell people what we want them to hear. And it's really true. And there's a new one that Donald Trump is thinking about putting in the CIA, who's currently an ambassador and over in the Netherlands, and he doesn't have a clue about what's going on in the deep state. I had a friend from England who's, from the Netherlands, and he was having dinner with him, and he sent me an email, and he said, Joel, what do you suggest I ask this ambassador who's up for naming to the CIA Donald Trump? And I said, ask him if he's aware that the deep state created ISIS. That's it. Just one question. And see what kind of reaction you get. Well, he wasn't able to talk to the ambassador. He was very busy during the dinner. We're talking to other people. But he got a sit down with his wife and talked for about a half an hour with his wife. And he asked her that question. And she just blinked her eyes. What do you mean? What's the deep state? Well, Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh think the deep state are a bunch of Obama holdovers in the bureaucracy that are trying to undo Donald Trump. It's much more than that. The deep state is lethal. They have units, large units, hundreds and thousands of people in every federal law enforcement agency. And that's why they have all those arms. There's a dark side of the FBI. There's a dark side of the CIA. There's a dark side of the DEA. There's a dark side of the NSA. And they're all run by the deep state. And so it would be very difficult, even if I were president, to root out the deep state. Because you see, you can't go and say, because of what you seem to be doing, I'm accusing you of this and that, or you've got to be conspiring to do this and that. You've got to have proof. And to get proof, you'd have to go to the NSA and say, I want you to wiretap all these people, George Soros, we want to trace their phone calls between he and Obama and Clinton and all these people. Let's get all the goods on them. They'd come back and say, there's nothing there. Because they're deep state. They're not going to blow the whistle on their own people. It's like Donald Trump the other day. Devin Nunes of the Intelligence Committee, when the Republicans were running the show, the Department of Justice under Jeff Sessions, who must have been blackmailed by the deep state because he became a nothing person when he was Attorney General. He did nothing for anybody except recuse himself. And so Nunes went to President Trump and said, we want these classified documents declassified, which the Attorney General is refusing to give to us. And Trump said, okay, we'll declassify them. And then somebody put it in the ear of Donald Trump to let Bill Barr make the final decision. So Trump bragged about it. I'm just going to let I trust Bill Barr. Bill Barr's going to have the final decision whether to declassify this. That was 3 months ago. Has it been declassified? Not in your life. Bill Barr's deep state. He was H.W. Bush's Attorney General. He was the one who covered up for Iran-gate, for Iran-Contra, for all the drug smuggling revealed by Terry Reid in his book Compromised. You can still get that on Amazon. It's an eye-opener. That was during a Republican administration. It's all the same. They just keep running the drugs. They keep the deep state operational. That doesn't mean there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats. There may be no difference in the hierarchy, but there is among the rank and file people. Now, this has been a war against Donald Trump between the deep state. And the first half of 2019 was a war over the Mueller investigation. And it's been going on for more than 2019. And it failed. The Mueller couldn't find any proof, and so it failed in the early summer. And coincidentally, the attack on Donald Trump for the impeachment process began less than 30 days after that. In other words, the deep says, we're not going to take no for an answer. Put out a call to all our people in the White House. We want something on Donald Trump. And that's when Lieutenant Colonel Vindman telephoned Chiaramelo and said, I've got what we need. And that's what we've been dealing with now for the last half of 2019. This is a real war on Donald Trump. And let me cover what's going on in the impeachment. Donald Trump was very wise for releasing the transcript. Of course, the transcript between his call and Ukrainian President Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky, doesn't tell the whole story. It's, as Donald Trump said, there's nothing there, and there isn't. Now, he asked him to investigate CrowdStrike, which was a Democratic operative organization running DNC's cybersecurity and software, and Joe Biden and his son Hunter, because of Hunter's relationship with the company Burisma, which is an energy natural gas company in Ukraine. Let me just give you a background on the former Soviet states. As some of you have heard my speech or maybe subscribing to the World Affairs Brief, I have documented for many years how the fall of the Soviet Union was a carefully crafted deception. The Communist Party just went underground, chose drunk Boris Yeltsin to front for them in a so-called democracy, so that they could get aid and trade from the West, which they did in spades. Western oil companies rebuilt the entire oil industry of Russia, and that's why they became the top oil exporter after a few years after the phony fall of the Soviet Union. In the meantime, did they give up any of their weapons? Not really. In fact, we had the Nunn-Lugar law from Senators Nunn and Lugar, which basically, with U.S. taxpayer money, paid the former Soviet Union to dismantle all of their older missiles that were decrepit anyway, but gave back the warheads to Russia. And we built a state-of-the-art nuclear refurbishing warhead facility for them in Russia so that they could do that. And as soon as that facility was complete, they locked out our inspectors so that we couldn't tell what they were doing. Now, part of the Nunn-Lugar agreement is that the West would buy back the recycled uranium from these warheads. But there's no way, once they're recycled in this plant, to tell the difference between new uranium and old uranium. And so the West continued to buy uranium, and the Russians continued to recycle the warheads into the new and modern warheads as they've continued to build weapons. New missiles with 15 warheads each, including maneuvering warheads now, which we don't have any missile defense for. So, but what happened is they did release the former Soviet states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, all of those countries, and Ukraine. But interestingly enough, as part of the phony fall of the Soviet Union, none of the communist bureaucrats in any of those countries ever were fired. They all retained their jobs. And as was typical in communist countries, the bureaucrats would always get bribes. Communism is for the dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, we're the dictators in charge of making sure that you, the proletariat, get your fair share of the wealth. But communism has always been a back-end feeding trough for the wealthy elite, which are the communist hierarchs. I mean, you never realized that until after the fall, that the real heads of the Soviet Union, Boris Berezovsky and Zvinsky, and Khodorkovsky of the Yukos Oil Company, et cetera, these are the major oligarchs that were surrounding Yeltsin. And how did they get wealthy, by the way? It's because they were the former communist boss that picked Brezhnev. Brezhnev was a mid-level arms control negotiator 2 years before he ascended to premier. Is that how you get to be premier in the Soviet Union? If somebody names you premier, who's naming you? That's the real boss. So you see, they went from a Stalin and Khrushchev, where you kill the people and you rise at the top, to a system where the top leaders of the Communist Party stay in the background and pick front people. They're learning from the West, you see. Pick front people, puppet presidents, puppet premiers to front for you. And Boris Berezovsky was chosen as head of the Commonwealth of Independent States after the fall of the Soviet Union. One of my contacts in Moscow wrote me that he saw Boris Yeltsin step aside and let Berezovsky enter for him. Now, in Russian hierarchy, that means Berezovsky's ahead of him, on top. He's his boss, or he wouldn't have stepped. The president of Russia wouldn't have stepped aside and let him in. Now, there was a coup, however. Putin overthrew the original oligarchs when he rose. Now, the original oligarchs chose Putin. Putin met with Boris Berezovsky in his Spanish villa 5 times the year he ascended to the presidency. So you know who was giving orders to Vladimir Putin? It was Boris Berezovsky. But about 3 years later, Putin had Berezovsky killed in London. And he had Zhuzinski, which was a Jewish oligarch, exiled to Israel. And he had Khodorkovsky locked up in jail, and several of the others. In other words, he overthrew all the original oligarchs and chose new ones. So there's a new series of oligarchs around him, and they're protected by Putin. In other words, they've returned to the old strongman system. Putin is the new Khrushchev. He's the new Stalin. He's going to be there when World War III happens. And he's got his own set of oligarchs, and Putin is probably the wealthiest man in the world now. Makes George Soros look like a piker, because he's getting 4% of all of the take of all of the individual oligarchs that he's protecting. So that gold-plated palace in Sochi, remember the Sochi Olympics, and the news media would take you through this palace that Putin was staying in. Oh no, it's not mine, it belongs to the government. No, it belongs to Putin. So the problem is with all of these former Soviet states like Ukraine is that the old communist bureaucracy is still in place, and they're still taking bribes for everything and making themselves wealthy. And that's why everyone has been so concerned about dealing with foreign aid with these former Soviet states, because of the bribery and the corruption that's going on. And part of that corruption, in fact, the Biden situation is much, much worse than what the press has told you about. Not only did Hunter Biden, for sitting on the board of directors, of which he knows nothing about energy and doesn't speak Ukrainian, sitting on the board of directors, got $87,000 a month. A month. But that's not all. Joe Biden got several $1 million for arranging that seat on the board. So is Joe Biden guilty of corruption? You bet he is. And when prosecutor Shokin went after Hunter Biden and started prosecuting him, and they have quite a dossier on Burisma. Burisma, in fact, the chairman of Burisma was one of the ministers of energy in the prior administration under President Poroshenko. And he gave all these contracts to Burisma. That's why Burisma became such a big... And then he becomes the chairman and starts to make millions of dollars. I mean, this is just such a corrupt circle of influence in Ukraine. And what did they need? They ran out of money, of course, and they needed a loan guarantee of $1 billion. And so Joe Biden, and he brags about this in a video with the CFR, before the CFR. I mean, this is on tape. I have to just really cringe about NPR, the PBS NewsHour. They have this woman journalist, Yamiche Alcindra, who happens to be African-American, and she's very smug. And she was playing a tape about 3 weeks ago of Donald Trump bragging at the Ohio rally about the corruption of Joe Biden, and said, we have it on tape of Joe Biden bragging about corruption in Ukraine. How many of you have seen that tape, by the way? Oh, that's very good. So I'm speaking to the choir here. And then after that tape closes, just as she's closing it, and by the way, that claim by Donald Trump, there is no evidence for that claim of corruption by, no evidence. What do you mean no evidence? We have his confession on videotape. And here's what he said. I told President Poroshenko, my plane is leaving in 6 hours, and if that prosecutor isn't fired, you're not getting $1 billion. Is that a quid pro quo? Boy, and the Democrats have the audacity to try to prosecute and impeach Donald Trump for something as mild as saying, I'd like you to investigate. And is there any pressure? No. Volodymyr Zelensky is a fan of Donald Trump. He says in there, I'm your biggest fan. Whatever you need me to do, I'd love to do for you, Donald Trump. There's no pressure needed for that kind of a thing. Now, what happened, though, the quid pro quo was not mentioned in the tape, but the quid pro quo is mentioned by Rudy Giuliani. He gets sent to Ukraine to say, look, we're going to give you this aid package, but we want you to make an announcement about this investigation. And the reason he required an announcement be made is because Zelensky is dealing with his own deep state in Ukraine. In other words, there's this corrupt bureaucracy who's not about to investigate and they're taking money from the U.S. and from all kinds of other, and George Soros and other places. And so you had to apply pressure to the bureaucracy. And as proof that the bureaucracy was going to follow through, wanted President Zelensky to make a public statement that they were going to investigate. Well, the public statement never happened, and the aid went through anyway. And the reason was because they raised this impeachment thing and tried to attack Donald Trump on holding back, for political purposes, this aid. And so Donald Trump quickly released the aid. That's why Zelensky didn't have to make the announcement. There was a quid pro quo. My point I've made in the World Affairs Brief is Donald Trump should defend himself on the merits. That there's always been a quid pro quo for every piece of foreign aid for time immemorial in the United States. We would be stupid to give foreign aid to a country when there's a problem there, and we want that problem solved if you get the foreign aid. He can defend that. He can give dozens of examples. But what did Donald Trump do? He made a big mistake. He said, I didn't tell Rudy Giuliani to pressure Ukraine or to give any quid pro quo. And that's why he can't let any of his closest advisors appear before the Inquisition, because they would ask them under oath, did Donald Trump say to you personally? And they would have to, unless they want to lie, admit that he did tell them. So this is obstruction of justice, according to the Congress. The president exercising executive privilege. It's not obstruction. That's part of the Constitution. That's not a violation of the Constitution. There are three equal separate branches of the Constitution: executive, legislative, and judicial. They're equal. And part of that equality is one can't force the other to do what he wants them to do, like testify before us. I can declare executive privilege. Neither can the president force Congress to come before him and do something. They can claim congressional legislative immunity. And of course, everybody knows the courts are untouchable. And they become the new rulers of the nation, and they're mostly deep state, especially at the higher appellate and Supreme Court levels. Even the conservatives. You heard about Anita Hill and Justice Thomas. She wasn't the only one that he harassed. He was a sexual predator. Now, he's conservative, but he's immoral as well. Okay, John Roberts, conservative generally, but he's got secrets and they can blackmail him. And that's why when he got the phone call of the night during the Obamacare ruling, he was opposing Obamacare, and they said, you need to change your vote, and he did. Now, Brett Kavanaugh, that Trump gave to the Supreme Court, is a conservative jurist, but he's also deep state. You say, well, what's going on there? How can he be deep state and be a conservative? It's because that's how they fool you conservatives into thinking that Donald Trump has been a success. He's named Brett Kavanaugh. And, he had some loosey-goosey ways of handling himself in high school, and those, may or may not have been true, but he certainly was a drinker and carrying on. But that was what most fraternity people do who weren't Christians or weren't Mormons. But that wasn't the issue. Nobody brought out that Brett Kavanaugh was Ken Starr's number 2 during the Vince Foster murder cover-up, where the federal government tried to proclaim that it was a suicide. He was suicided, and they tried to say he committed suicide. And there was one particular witness who was parked at Fort Marcy Park and who testified that Vince Foster's red Honda was not in the parking lot. In fact, he said there were 4 other burly federal agents that kept glaring at me, wanting me to leave, because they didn't want him to see them dragging the body out, into the park and planting the gun in his hand and making it look like a suicide. Well, it was Brett Kavanaugh who was in charge of discrediting this witness. And he was harassed incessantly. He would walk down the street and big burly federal agents would bump into him and sneer at him and say, "You'd better change your testimony." He was sitting at a restaurant and somebody would come over and dump coffee on him, And when he finally got into the hearings, what did he see on the witness stand? All those FBI agents were the ones that were harassing him. Now that's part of the deep state. Every single agency of federal law enforcement has this cadre of evil deep staters. And, I had a particular experience with one informant of the FBI who was complaining to me about not being able to get paid by because it goes back to the Ronald Reagan years. And he had found out that the Committee in Solidarity with El Salvador, which he was infiltrating on behalf of the FBI, was planning an assassination on Ronald Reagan. You'd think his FBI handler would be interested in that, right? But he wasn't. The FBI handler claimed he lost the paperwork. He left his gun and the paperwork in his car while he went into a restaurant for a cup of coffee. Well, my dad was an FBI agent. No agent leaves their gun and their classified documents in a car, even if it's locked, and goes in and has a cup of coffee. So that was a lie, to lose the report. Well, he wasn't getting paid after a while because, so he came to a doctor, and a doctor was a subscriber of mine. The doctor called me, and I was in Washington as the chairman of the Conservative National Committee, and said, "Can you help this guy get paid?" And I said, "Well, I think so. I don't know anybody in the FBI, but I got a CIA friend who can find out for me." So I told the CIA, and he said, "Look, before I call the FBI, I've got to have his code name." So I called back, got the guy's code name, gave it to the CIA. He calls the FBI headquarters, said, "Now look, Joel, I'm going to tell you, nobody's going to know who this little guy, an informant in Texas is. So don't hold out much hope that you're going to get any answers for this guy." And so he calls the FBI and he gives them the code name, and suddenly he said, all hell broke loose. Everybody at headquarters knew who that code name was. Of this little lowly Latino informant in Dallas, Texas. And within a half an hour, I had 2 FBI agents at my home wanting to know how I found out about this and who else knows. And I said, "Look, I'm just trying to get this guy paid. His handler's mishandling this case, and he claims he's lost this. He's got significant information about an assassination attempt on President Reagan. You should be interested in that." No, we're only interested in how you knew about this and who else knows. In other words, clamp down on the leak in something that was part of a deep, dark secret. So I wouldn't tell him. I said, "Look, I'm just not going to tell you." And so anyway, he goes to the telephone in the kitchen. I heard him on the phone. "No, he won't tell me. I can't twist his arm. He's just not going to tell me." And so they go on. These were guys on the white side, clean-cut, naive, honest. These weren't dark side agents threatening me. These are just white side agents. And they love to pick Mormon returned missionaries to be in the white side of the FBI and the CIA. Because they're patriotic. They believe in government unconstitutional. They don't believe in conspiracy. They think everything's hunky-dory. They make great patsies for the white side. I can't tell you how many Mormons I've had who are FBI agents or CIA who come and tell, "Joel, I'm in the FBI. I would know." What do you mean you would know? Look, I've been in the military. Do I know all the secrets in the military? Haven't you ever heard about need to know? Are there classified things that are above your range? Well, yes. So then how do you dare tell me that you would know because you're in the FBI? You're in there because you won't see and can't see. Well, I flew down to Dallas after this experience with the FBI because I wanted to talk to this guy in Spanish, which I speak Spanish. And so in interviewing him, he said, "I want to tell you something very interesting that happened." He took me to a party one time, after we'd had a couple of drinks, he pointed out to me, "You see this ring we're all wearing?" It was a big class ring. And it wasn't Stanford, it wasn't Harvard, it wasn't Yale, it wasn't FBI. It was kind of a weird looking ring. And he said, "Congress doesn't know we exist. We have separate funding. We do all of the legal acts that the FBI or the CIA can't do." that guy's DEA, that guy's CIA, that guy's FBI, that guy's this and that, and you know, all over these federal, they were having a big joint party. That was the dark side he got introduced to. And he lived to tell about it. Well, you know, even the media got a view into the dark side once. I don't know if you ever heard about the big interagency party that they had a nigger hanging tree at. And they invited a reporter to be at this party, and he was just terribly shocked that they would have a nigger hanging tree. Or they even used the word nigger, and it was printed right on a sign, you know, and this was all federal agents. And he blew the whistle on them. Big front page article in the Wall Street Journal about interagency party with racial bias and racial epithets and hanging a Negro in effigy. Not one of them asked the question. This shows that, you know, these media people aren't dumb. They just know where not to go because some editor is going to clamp down on them. Not one of them asked the questions, what were all these different agents doing at a party together at federal expense? Where is the authorization to have a multi-agency party? Sure, and you do racial epithets, but the bigger question is, he was invited to a deep state function and didn't know it. So the deep state is real. The deep state killed John F. Kennedy. The deep state killed Robert F. Kennedy. Why? Because he was going after the mafia. The CIA has an integral relationship with the mafia. They let the mafia do killings. Like there were several mafia hitmen that were on the grassy knoll that assassinated John F. Kennedy, so they didn't have to have CIA people shoot him, which would have been a problem. So they call up the mafia people. And Robert Mueller was part of the cover-up of Mr. Bulger in Chicago, who was a mafia chieftain that a couple of white side FBI agents wanted to prosecute. And he ended up framing two other people to go to prison for Whitey Bulger to let him off the hook. Why? Because we have an FBI relationship with Bulger and we don't want him going to prison. So Robert Mueller, you're going to frame two people, let them go to prison instead? Is that what kind of integrity you have to be investigating Donald Trump? That's the kind of person Robert Mueller. Robert Mueller was also involved with Christopher Wray, the new FBI director, in the cover-up of 9/11, which was also a deep state operation from beginning to end, including the hiring of the terrorists, remote-controlled aircraft from the West Coast that exchanged places with the airplanes from Boston Logan and came in to attack the World Trade Centers, modified aircraft, big bulging side, full of something that accelerated what was happening. The aircraft that hit the Pentagon had a missile under its wing that blew a hole in that Pentagon wall before it crashed into it. That's why you see in the Pentagon movie a big white, bright explosive as the airplane slams into the Pentagon. I'll tell you, as a person who knows about airplanes, who's a pilot and has understand a lot of accidents, when airplanes crash, it's red and black smoke only, no white. White is high explosive. That's why the military people running out of the building smelled cordite. Somebody set off explosives. Well, the terrorists couldn't have put a missile under the wing of the airplane. That's much more than hijacking, isn't it? All of those buildings loaded with explosives, from thermite to melt down the 47 major pillars to the timed explosive remote control that would take the building down at free fall speed. And then building 7 that wasn't even hit came down at free fall speed. Architects for 9/11 Truth has 1,500 architects and engineers that say NIST lied when they said and certified that Building 7 came down of its own volition because of fire. Just incredible. And yet, because they control the media, people believe what's being said, or at least some people do. And that's why I divide this nation into 3 groups, and that's what we're dealing with. There's about an equal amount on the far left, radical people, as there are on the right, who are now very ardent Trump supporters. And there's about 20 to 30%, let's say an average of 25% in the middle, that just aren't committed either way, that pride themselves in being non-committed independents and know nothing, see nothing. And those are the people that are going to make the difference in this nation. Because you see, Donald Trump could not have won the election just by appealing to conservatives, and that's why he became a populist. Actually, I shouldn't say became, he was always a populist. He was always going to go where the wind blows and choose what's going to be a liberty. Now, I'm not saying he's a total chameleon, because he does have some good instincts that are conservative. He just doesn't have any background to back it up, so he can't defend it. That's why he's all over the map and he changes his mind so much. But when we go up an election, we haven't had the majority in this country for years. We haven't had a majority. Republicans have been a minority and Democrats have been a minority. There's been this in-between independents that have made the difference here. And oftentimes you get unknowing, uneducated, non-committed, unprincipled Republicans who are Republicans for economic reasons, because they're big businessmen and they want to keep their tax money. So they're conservative. They don't know anything about the vaccine cover-up that we've been talking about today. Probably the biggest, broadest based conspiracy outside of the deep state itself in this country, such that Facebook will never allow you to publish or post anything about vaccine dangers. Google will not allow you to see anything about vaccine dangers. I use DuckDuckGo, which doesn't filter. Don't use StartPage. StartPage gives you privacy, but it uses Google. So I did a comparison. Vaccine dangers I put up on Google, and got only debunking sites, debunking the vaccine dangers. Only. You had to go back 30 pages to get anything, and nobody's going to go back that far, about vaccine dangers. DuckDuckGo right up front. Vaccine dangers, all of the best websites, etc. So don't ever use Google again. Ban it from your vocabulary. Teach people that we need to go with DuckDuckGo, and hopefully they won't get compromised someday either. I don't use Facebook, because it's a spy agency. And you just have to start to boycott these people. Don't use Instagram. You know, all these people are unprincipled, and they will not defend what is right. We have to make them pay an economic price. So in this war against Donald Trump and impeachment, we're hearing a new argument this week as it's come before the Judiciary Committee. And by the way, the reason why this went before the Intelligence Committee under Adam Schiff is because the Intelligence Committee is the only committee in Congress that can hold meetings in secret. Why? Because it's about intelligence. Is the impeachment about intelligence? No. In fact, one of the Republican chairmen, or not chairman, the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee challenged Chairman Schiff and said, tell me where in the House rules does it give you the authority to hold impeachment hearings as the Intelligence Committee? And he wouldn't. I said, I will not entertain any irrelevant questions. This is not irrelevant. Where do you get the power? I get it through the deposition power, rule number 11. And he, of course, knew the rules. It said rule number 11 doesn't say anything about the intelligence. Says that a deposition can be had in private, etc., but it doesn't say anything about the intelligence committee. Where do you get your authority? He refused to answer. I mean, this is how dishonest these people are. Now, it comes up, and we heard 3 virulent anti-Trump attorneys Wednesday testify about the constitutionality of impeaching Donald Trump. One even saying, if this isn't impeachable, nothing is impeachable. As if this is so clearly impeachable. What? Quid pro quos that are done every day and no pressure, and investigating a political opponent? Well, let me tell you something. They, of course, only subscribe to the political motive here. They say, and we heard this phrase numerous times on Wednesday, President Trump solicited interference in foreign interference in our election. Solicited foreign interference in our election. This is like the Russian investigation never happened. Remember how everyone told you it was a fact Russia interfered with our investigation or our election? Not at all. Buying a few Facebook ads on both Republican or conservative and liberal issues, is that interfering in your election? Hardly. They claim, and the NSA can falsify the derivation of any internet traffic, and they claim that the Russians hacked into some state registration sites. Can you vote from a registration site? Can you interfere in elections through registration? Not unless you change a lot of registrations. But none of them were changed to Republican. So how is this interfering with your election? So you see, it was phony on its face. And so now they are accusing Donald Trump of soliciting foreign interference with our election. You know, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Who's the biggest interferer in other foreign elections? It's the deep state. It's the CIA. In Austria, for example, this year, they revealed a honey trap. And a honey trap is where you have a sexual liaison where you lure in a conservative and you film them, and then you release it at some time to destroy his political career. And that's what they did to the head of the Freedom Party that was part of the Austrian government, one of the coalition partners. And so they revealed it, so he had to resign. The Freedom Party lost their position in the coalition so that it brought down the anti-EU party that was ruling Austria. That's how these people work. This year we saw the destruction of Brexit. You know, they're going to get us into a new world order someday. And if you think it's going to be easy, you can just get out when you want to. You just look at Britain and how they sabotaged the Brexit. What is the first thing they did? They took a person who voted against the Brexit, Theresa May, and had the Prime Minister, Cameron, resign so that she could then be the new Prime Minister. And what is the first thing? I'm going to champion Brexit. I'm going to make sure it happens. Don't you smell a rat? When an anti-Brexit person suddenly changes and says, I'm going to champion this, and she sabotaged the whole thing. Her first act in Parliament was to enact a law that brought all of EU law and made it a part of British law. Now, you're going to get out of the EU, right? So what we need to do is bring in all EU law, make it part of British law, and then we can pick and choose what we want to take out. How hard it is to take out, you know, once it's in law? It's very, very difficult. That's the kind of person that she was. And then she kept delaying and delaying. And she said, now, if we don't get a deal, and finally they got a deal with the EU, and of course, it had this, what's called the British backstop in it, whereby Ireland would be still, because Ireland is split into two. The Republic of Ireland was part of the EU. Northern Ireland is part of the UK. And so what do you do? If Brexit goes out, that means Northern Ireland and Ireland have to be separated by a hard border so that you don't have all these Muslim refugees coming into the UK through Ireland. Well, the Irish don't want a hard border. And so the deal that Theresa May cuts is you'll have the hard border between Northern Ireland and the UK. Make the UK put up all these customs things and make the poor Northern Irish pay all this duties and customs getting into the UK. Well, that wasn't going to fly in the UK. So this went on, and Theresa May always said, well, if this isn't all settled by March 19th, we're getting out anyway. Did that happen? No. Got a postponement to April, got a postponement to June. And then, because she had betrayed the Brexit, she got ousted as Prime Minister. And they always have a backup, don't they? Boris Johnson, who claimed to be pro-Brexit. He gets elected Prime Minister. I'm going to champion Brexit. And he proceeds to sabotage it. And now we're in limbo. We're going to have a new election, and he's probably not going to win. I mean, the Conservatives are going to win, but this is going to go on, and the people are getting tired of it. In fact, if they held another referendum today, they've made the British people so tired, they would probably vote against the Brexit. So they've killed it. They've killed it. And if they do end up, Boris Johnson has a Brexit deal with Europe, and you can believe me, if Europe agrees to an agreement with England, it's going to be a disaster, because they're not going to let them out without. And what's the secret deal? Well, the secret deal is that the EU is trying to dump NATO and create its own EU army. And they already have a secret deal. Theresa May already paid almost, I think it was 250 billion pounds secretly to a slush fund in the EU while she's cutting defense system in Britain. We don't have the money for new Poseidon aircraft. We don't have the money for new aircraft. We don't have the money for this, because she's paying it under the table to the EU for the new EU army. And what's that all about? I believe the new EU army is going to be the seed stock for the new globalist New World Order. And as I've told every year that I've come to Highland, I think what happens is that we get into a war with Russia and China, we absorb a nuclear first strike, and without our military, our leaders come out of their bunkers and say, we are now defenseless unless we join in a militarized global government to prosecute this glorious motherhood and apple pie war. It's like World War II all over again. The greatest generation will rise to fight again in the name of the New World Order. And who will say nay after you've absorbed a nuclear first strike? preceded by an EMP strike where you don't have any electricity. Your protestations will be feeble compared to the disaster. Everyone will say to you, oh, don't worry about this conspiracy, or we're in a war. You've got to be patriotic. You've got to send your youth to go fight and die for the New World Order. You've got to be prepared for that. I worry about the conservative feeling about everything in the military is patriotic. Everywhere I go, because I served in the military, everybody thanks me for my service. Thank you for your service. Well, you know, people in the service get paid money. They're not sacrificing. Some of the people in combat do pay with their lives, but that's a very small percentage of the military. Almost 90% of the military is non-combat, and it gets paid very well. So forget about thanking you for your service. I got paid very well, thank you. I wasn't there because of service necessarily, because the problem with the military today is that they are supporting globalist causes. They're not defending our freedom. How are they defending our freedom in Afghanistan or in Syria or attacking Iran, which is another big subject of 2019? How is that defending our freedom? Well, it's because if we don't get into Afghanistan, those terrorists coming out of it are going to overwhelm our country and come through our open borders, which we're keeping open, attacked. That's what they sold to Donald Trump. Why do we have troops, he said, in 150 countries around the world? Because of terrorism. Well, who created the war on terror? Who did 9/11? It was our own deep state. Who created ISIS? It was our own deep state. They took 50% of the Syrian rebels and said, you're now ISIS. Gave them new leaders. Now, they didn't have a big group together and announcement. But through their leaders, who were mostly trained by Israeli Mossad, that's an integral part of the globalist New World Order, those leaders came out and said, all right, we're starting anew. We're breaking away from this. We're starting anew, and we're going to be called ISIS. And what do you do as your first thing in ISIS? You attack the whole world. You attack Muslims, Christians, you kill people, you dress them up in orange jumpsuits, and you behead journalists. And you do everything to antagonize the world. Is that how you build a caliphate? Antagonize the whole world? Of course not. You do if you're trying to make enemies of the whole world, if you're trying to beef up the war on terror. I mean, we got tired of hearing about Al-Qaeda. And suddenly it was ISIS. And ISIS is everybody. These white pickup trucks that came from a U.S., order that was diverted to the Middle East. Hundreds of white Toyota Hilux pickup trucks, identical. How did ISIS get those? How did ISIS get their billions of dollars to fund? Well, selling oil that they captured when they took over Syria. Where were they selling the oil to? To Turkey and to Israel. That's what all those caravan of trucks were lined up at the Turkish border, waiting to go and sell the oil there. And the Russians bombed them and said to the U.S., this is what you should be doing if you're fighting ISIS. Well, the U.S. wasn't fighting ISIS. Yeah, we were bombing empty buildings, because every time we'd get a bombing run, the deep state would alert their ISIS leaders to have the building empty. So Navy pilots were bombing buildings and coming back and saying, we destroyed the target, having a big success rate, but those buildings were empty. And so when the U.S. got embarrassed by the Russian who bombed this convoy sitting at the Turkish border with oil, they threw out leaflets of an airplane so that none of the truck drivers were there. We just destroyed a few trucks. And it's the only time the U.S. bombed ISIS oil. And then we rescued ISIS in Mosul. They surrounded ISIS and then left a sector open so that ISIS could escape into Syria. The Iraqis complained to the U.S. that they saw U.S. helicopters coming in and taking out ISIS leaders and rescuing them. And you didn't hear about that in the press, but the Iraqis don't like the Americans because of this phony war on ISIS. The Iraqis complained to President Obama 3 times about 2 massive arms depots that were being set up in the middle of the desert and said, these are a problem for us. We want you to attack those. The Obama administration says, no, we're not going to attack them. And that was ISIS war depot material. That's how this thing goes. Now, you can find little bits and pieces of this information on the alternate news sources. That's how I find it. I don't have any insider sources. I wouldn't trust them if I did. Because there's no way an insider can be talking to Alex Jones or anybody else and not get caught by the NSA, which surveils everything, telephone, everything. Unless he's walking down there in person, You can't get away with that. So when Alex says I got a source within the White House talking to me constantly, it's disinformation. So is QAnon, claiming to be deep state, or claiming that Trump is going to join forces with, guess who, Robert Mueller, and overcome the deep state. Got a Brooklyn Bridge to sell you if you buy into that. The Robert Mueller deep state is going to help Donald Trump overcome the deep state. He's just fooling the conservatives. He's keeping them attached to the illusion that we're going to beat the deep state. I'm very pessimistic about it, and I know a lot about it. I'm very pessimistic because they control every aspect of government at a dark side level. They control all of the appellate and Supreme Court judges. They control about 75% of Congress with dirt, and that's what Jeffrey Epstein was all about this year. Jeffrey Epstein was running a deep state operation. Now, a lot of conspiracy things talk about him being an Israeli spy because Gisela Maxwell, his madam, Epstein's madam, the father of that worked for Israel. And so Gisela Maxwell must have been an Israeli spy as well. No, it doesn't work that way. The point is, Israel is an integral part of the deep state, at least the Mossad is. That's their deep state in Israel, all right? They run terrorists on behalf of the U.S. They do assassinations on behalf of the U.S. Yeah, they had a few people filming 9/11 that were rejoicing when the towers came down, but it doesn't mean it was an Israeli operation. It was just a minor thing. This was way too big even for Israel to do. But the NSA, by the way, has subcontracted with Israel most of the domestic spying for decades to Israeli companies. And that's why it's very easy to get the feeling like Israeli is running this show, but it isn't. It's the NSA, it's the bigger deep state running, and Israeli Mossad is part of it. And one of the reasons why they let Israel do most of the domestic surveillance is so that because it was illegal for the NSA to do it. So they're going to have a foreign company do it. And in addition, they wanted Israel to be able to spy on all of the corporate secrets so that they could steal technology. And that's why Israel has come up so quickly in technological aspects, is because they've been able to eavesdrop on all of the communication between every company in the United States and steal the technology. And what's one of the worst things is, the way that the globalists have built these enemies, Russia and China, is by allowing technology transfers. Now, a lot of that's been shut down because of conservatives in the United States. The Commerce Department during the Clinton administration was sending and authorizing a lot of stuff going to China, including satellite and missile technology. And they're still doing it under Trump, by the way. Trump doesn't know about it. But they started doing it through Israel. Israel was allowed to steal the secrets, and then Israel was allowed to sell secrets to gain money to China. And that's still going on today. That's a very, very sad state of affairs. So there's a conundrum that Christians have who've been taught about, God raising up Israel and as being a godly thing, and Christians are beset with this concept. It's true. The Lord has returned Israel to, at least the Jews to the house of Israel. The 10 tribes are somewhere else that nobody knows, but the Jews have been returned to Israel. But it doesn't mean that they're righteous. The Lord does many things because of promises to the fathers generations ago, just like to the Lamanites in the Book of Mormon, to the prophets that he made promises to redeem the land. He has to go through it. It doesn't mean that the Lamanites were worthy. There were some of the worst people in the plains. I mean, it was this whole Hollywood image about the Indians being true to the environment and all these, saintly people. Just not true. They were ruthless. They were internecine warfare between Indians in this country, killing each other, raping and taking hostages constantly. Only the Nez Perce in Oregon were the least non-aggressive of the Indians. The rest of them were just terrible. So even, I've been to Israel many times, and I'll tell you, it's the most unrighteous, worldly country I've been in. It's like a typical Middle Eastern country, yelling out the window, cursing, honking your horn. There's no peace in Israel. And you go to the Christian sites, and you go through all of these, down the Via Dolorosa, which is 15 feet above what it really was, and you pay all this money. These are just commercial things. You can feel the Spirit of the Lord in the Garden Tomb, which they don't recognize, probably where Christ really was buried. But the point is, just because the house of Israel has been returned to Israel doesn't mean that they're righteous. And it doesn't mean that the government of Israel is righteous, because it's involved with the deep state. Benjamin Netanyahu, which is just about ready to be out on his ear because of corruption, decades of corruption. All the globalists are corrupt. Ariel Sharon was corrupt. Ehud Barak was corrupt. He got killed. That was their own JFK assassination over there. But Benjamin Netanyahu takes the cake, and he's a Kissinger protege. Educated in the United States, paid for, his education was paid for by Kissinger. His first job in Wall Street was handed to him by Kissinger and Associates. He's a globalist, masquerading as a conservative. You see what I'm saying? I'm painting a picture. You have to be very, very careful. Paul Ryan betrayed us all during Trump's first year, when he had control of what? The White House, Congress, and both houses of Congress. Paul Ryan wouldn't let any of that wall legislation through. Somebody got to Paul Ryan. He used to be an actual legitimate conservative, but he's been bought out somehow. I'm worried about Mike Lee, Senator Lee here. Senator Lee is now carrying water for every big tech, Google, Apple, conglomerate in Silicon Valley. He just introduced legislation trying to separate part of the airspace dedicated and let Google and everyone else who's going to run these autonomous drones and Amazon deliveries have their own air, and they determine, not the FAA, that the corporations are going to run a whole locked-in portion of airspace. And boy, I'll tell you, we as general aviation pilots are very much against letting those corporations have a whole bunch of airspace exclusively theirs that we can't fly into. It's up to the drones to make sure they see and avoid everyone else, not have their own locked-in airspace run by Google. We don't need deep state Google and deep state Amazon and deep state Facebook running this country. But that's how the deep state is more and more doing this now, is letting corporations do it. Like censoring. Google and Facebook are censoring the devil out of your information, because they know that's how you bypass the media, is through the alternate. And so they're capturing, and the CIA seed money started Google, CIA seed money started Facebook and protected it from lawsuits, etc. It's a very deep secret that's been going on. But that's what Trump is up again, and he doesn't have a clue. All he's got to run on is good instincts. But you see, what good are instincts if you haven't got the wherewithal to back it up when you're in front of a bunch of intelligent briefers who have any number of excuses to give you to explain it away? And you got to be really good to see past them and see past their excuses. You've got to have a big background in history of conspiracy and the deep state and everything to contradict that, and Trump doesn't have it. And they make sure that he has no advisors. Bannon is gone. Bannon really wasn't that good. He had some anti-globalist ideas, but he knew nothing about the deep state. But Bannon is gone. They won't let anybody near him. And if they did, I'll tell you, they would get leaked out, and the press would say, oh, there's a conspiracist whispering in Donald Trump's ear, and they would have him rooted out in a day. I'm trying to paint you a picture of what life is really like in this country. Because one of the things that we have a problem with is that, as a conservative, as a principal, because when I criticize Donald Trump, I get a lot of feedback, a lot of negative feedback, even from my subscribers. And I sat down one day to try to analyze, why is it, should they be complaining? They can't counter what I'm saying, because my criticism is true. Donald Trump is making mistakes. I've given credit for Donald Trump on every good thing that he's done in the World Affairs Brief. I've listed every one of them. But because his mistakes are about 90%, 9-to-1, I'm very critical, all right? So why should someone complain to hear the truth? I came to the conclusion that it's because I burst their bubble of hope. How many of you hoped that you won't have to really prepare or won't have to face World War III because Donald Trump's going to save us? How many have hoped that? I'll be honest. Yeah. So it's really discouraging when somebody with credibility, and I hope I'm credible before you, bursts that bubble. And I'm here to burst that bubble. Donald Trump is not going to save us. Not going to happen. The deep state's too big, too powerful. the witness of Moroni in the Book of Mormon saying, if you ever, speaking to America, let this secret combination gain power, and he wasn't talking about the Taliban or the mafia, if you ever let it get power, it's all over. Now, the big question is, how long will it take till we lose our freedom? And what's it going to look like? I'm here to tell you that we're going to lose our liberty slowly. And it's going to accelerate very rapidly in about 10 years at the maximum, probably, when we have World War III, because there's a lot of people on the internet talking about economic collapse, about hyperinflation, other types of things. That's not the way it's going to happen. We're going to be fat, dumb, and happy, wrangling and contention among ourselves until World War III comes, and then it's a whole new world, and it will never be the same again. Going from day to night, dusk to night, because it won't be nice. It already isn't nice. We're losing so much of our liberty. That's why I really object when people in church pray about living in this free country. If I were to pray, and they don't ask me to pray anymore, if I were to pray, I would thank the Lord for the few remaining freedoms that we have left. And people would say, what do you mean? Are we losing our freedom? The only church on the face of the earth that has scriptural warnings about secret combinations is mostly blind to it. And you are not among those. And I congratulate you. But unfortunately, most of you sent your children to public schools and they come away worldly. And there's one saying, no, I don't. Good for you. I homeschooled, my wife and I homeschooled. My wife did a lot of the work, all of our 6 children, and it turned out wonderful. And a lot of people said to us, aren't you worried about the lack of socialization they're going to get? That's one of the reasons we don't want public schools, is the socialization, which is snotty attitudes, bullying and other types of things, and worldly attitudes. And it just goes on. And my wife said, I walked into a public school the other day, and it just felt horrible. I mean, just hardly saw a really good, wholesome face. Everybody was interacting and jibing and, it's just not a good atmosphere, even in Zion, so to speak. And so I say, let the vaccines come and say you can't go to school. The more power to us. Stay out of the public schools. Will you? Now, I don't think that Donald Trump is going to get convicted of impeachment. I think he is going to be impeached. I think article impeachments are coming out before Christmas. Nancy Pelosi has said so. I just have to cringe, though, when I watch these Democrats talking about the founding fathers and the purity of the Constitution and all that. We haven't heard that from them for a lifetime. They always hated us for saying that, but they're all using those words now. Upholding the rule of law, But it is what it is, and because the media is aligned with them, their lies are going to inundate the world. I don't think that Donald Trump is going to be reelected. And so let's ask the question, what happens after Donald Trump? One of the big problems with Donald Trump is that because his rhetoric has been so delightful, his promises have been so wonderful, have created so much hope that someone's really going to do something. I'll give you a couple of examples. When's the last time you heard a president says, we need, and I'm going to use an executive order to do away with birthright citizenship? There's no reason that illegal aliens ought to come in and drop a baby in this country and have those babies be citizens. And I cheered. Wonderful. For the first time, someone's going to get rid of birthright citizens. There are women who pay hundreds and thousands of dollars to be trucked into the U.S. or flown in from China and others to drop a baby in the U.S. to have it be a citizen. No other country allows that. We shouldn't even allow people to become citizens when they're born here of citizens. Everyone, when they're about 18, should have to pass a test on constitutional, what's right and what's wrong about law and government, etc., before you become a citizen. We're raising people who are raised as Marxists in public schools who become citizens and are out voting us now. 30% of BYU students voted for Hillary Clinton in the last election. And the university bragged about it. They keep records on how many people they convert from creationism to evolution. And they brag about it. And BYU. They refuse to allow any debate on evolution. They don't want to hear the truth. You can't talk about the vaccine problems at BYU. And you give honorary doctorates to Dick Cheney, a globalist, and Brent Scowcroft, who works with Henry Kissinger, an arch globalist. Someday, when they get up to heaven, the Lord will put their arm around them and said, you know, you just gave, under your tenure at BYU, a doctorate to a Gadian, a modern-day Gadian. And for those of you who don't know the lingo of the Book of Mormon, the Gadians were the secret combinations in the days of ancient America, which the prophets warned us about. So it's a very difficult thing to deal with this life. But what's the problem? The problem with Donald Trump now, for 4 years, he has occupied the Republican Party, and there's been no room for any other leadership. And who can beat Donald Trump's rhetoric? You see, a principled conservative cannot promise what Donald Trump promises because it isn't principle. It's populist. I can't promise if I would go and be a politician to have Medicare for all. I can't promise that everybody retain your health insurance no matter what pre-existing conditions. People need to have the consequences for bad eating for generations. Those are pre-existing conditions. Why should I have to pay for that? You see? It's not just. No one talks about the just. It's just about the poor. Give the money to the poor. But you see, we need to make people accountable for their nutritional bad decisions. And even in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with its word of wisdom, we have an obesity problem in this nation, in this church, that is a gross violation of the Spirit of the Lord. And yet I have my temple recommend. I follow the word of wisdom. But what are you doing about listening to conscience? What are you doing about listening to the little nervous feelings? The little promptings to change your habits, not to buy that diet soda, not to buy that greasy donut, you know. You have to start to listen to those things. You know, I have to give credit to conservatives for listening to the proper feelings about law and government and conservatism. But you know, you ought to listen to them in the full range of life. Most of the promptings you get from conscience are about temporal things, not spiritual things. And you reject most of the temporal ones because you think you're just talking to yourself. Easy to disregard. It's not church related, so it can't be from the Lord, right? But it is. The Lord is very interested. He's testing your ability to listen to promptings by the temporal things to see if you're going to be worthy of higher knowledge through the spiritual things. And that's why you don't get higher light and knowledge, because you're still struggling with the temporal things. And that's why I'm very much opposed to the doctrine of perfection eventually, after this earth life. It'll be somehow gifted to you. I'm here to tell you that isn't true. If you start to listening to the little voice of conscience, you'll realize the Lord's interested in perfection here and now. He's after you to pick up after yourself, to be more clean, to eat the right things. In fact, the more you covenant with yourself, to listen to every little promptings, and don't violate any nervous feeling. When you feel nervous about it, don't do it. You'll come away, as I did 40 years ago, saying, wow, the Lord is really after me. He's not stroking and saying, it's okay, you'll get it someday, it'll all be gifted to you. He's not saying that. He's after you. And if you remember, you all have a conscience. And as I spoke those words, you all know that you remember dozens of little promptings that you've been getting and saying, no, I don't want to do that. Remember when you were a kid in high school, you were prompted to do your homework, and you instantly had that little word come in your mouth, oh no, you're too tired, or you need to go play first, or your kids are doing this. All those rationalizations, that's the interaction between the Lord and Satan, all coming through conscience. And conscience comes through your own vocabulary. Sounds like you talking to yourself. That's on purpose, so that you can't tell obviously whether it's the Lord or Satan talking to you. But if you start to listen and follow two general rules, you'll start to school your conscience and listen. And these are the two rules I taught my children. Never do anything you feel nervous about as to the correctness. And we're not talking about feeling nervous about giving a talk in church because you've never done it before. We're talking about nervousness as to the correctness. You don't feel it's quite right. Don't do it. learn to have ironclad self-control. If you feel like reaching for that soda and you feel, I'm hopefully reinforcing little conscience that you've long since said, that's not the Lord. Learn to say no. And then the second rule is, always force yourself to do that which you know you should do, especially when you don't feel like it. So when you know you should do your homework, but don't feel like it, do it. Force yourself to do it. If you don't feel like helping out around the house, but you know you should do it, force yourself to do it. Those two signals will cover 90% of everything in conscience. And the others are beneficial reminders. You're walking down the street and you get reminded to remember something or call someone, and you say, okay, I'll do it later. And then you forget, and you realize, oh, I was reminded. Learn to give thanks for every little reminder that you get that you know is right. And you will find that the amount of promptings that come to you increases until you become filled with light and be able to discern even the most difficult things. I use the little tests of conscience every day when I'm researching what to write in the World Affairs Brief on Friday. I read through hundreds of stories of news, and I can tell by little nervous feelings, not quite right, not good. The Lord didn't tell you what's right about it or what's wrong about it, but at least you know it's not right, and so you need to know where to research, and you go and look and you find that's junk, and that feels good. And then you have those calm feelings to let you know that feels good, that settles well with you. Now, you see, if Donald Trump had been really better at conscience, his instincts would be much more honed. He would have come to conservatism many years earlier, but his immorality has penalized him. Every time he was unfaithful to his wives and all the prostitutes that he went to in his life, and there were many, he was penalized in his conscience. Now, he still, because the Lord is interested in buying more time for us, gets enough nervous feelings that he's challenging his things. He just doesn't know what to do with them once he challenges them. That's the problem. But Donald Trump, bless his heart, has bought us more time. He has slowed the globalist agenda down. Climate change is still being drummed down to us, but he didn't go along with the Paris Climate Accord, and so at least it's been slowed down. Now, it's not going away. It's going to come back with a vengeance as soon as he's gone. In fact, they talked him into coming out of the Paris Paris Climate Agreement effective December 2020 after the election, because they know he's not going to be there. So it won't be, the next president will reverse it. These people are slick we're dealing with, really slick. So we've got to learn to be sharper ourselves. That's why we've got to live not just in general conservative feelings. We've got to get sharper in our lives, get our kids to be sharper, get our kids to be more prepared, get your kids tougher. If you knew right now what I know is coming in about 10 years with World War III and how bad it's going to be with no electricity and famine and starvation, you would say, I need not only to get prepared, but I need to get my kids toughened up, because they can't handle the kind of pressure that we're going to be under. It's really hard. And so the kind of feelings that we're getting about everything is good and God loves you, and which is always said unconditionally, no matter what. I'd say God has compassion for you no matter what you're doing. I mean, that's why you get disciplinary feelings. That's why you get nervous feelings in conscience, because the Lord's trying to fix you. That's a compassion type love, but you don't get acceptance love of the Lord unless you're doing what's right. Like he said to Hiram Smith, Hiram I love because of the integrity of his heart. That's a very conditional statement, by the way. If you do not what I say, the love of the Lord will not remain with you. Does that sound like unconditional love to you? Now, we don't use that anymore. Everyone knows that that's taboo, or should know that. But when you sit around and tell everybody that Lord loves you, Lord loves you, Lord loves you, you take that unconditionally. He must love me no matter what I do. But it's not true. He gives you disciplinary love. He gives you compassion, that outstretched arms, come on, do what's right, and even throws out consequences to you when you refuse to listen. That's why you have failed. That's why you have accidents sometimes. That's why you lose the blessings of protection. Not because there was any direct quid pro quo, but because you've been losing the blessings of protection over the years of refusing to listen to the promptings. That's the way the Lord deals with us. So I'm trying to say to you, we need to prepare for what's coming by becoming very, very sensitive to the direction of the Lord in the temporal affairs, especially, because that's how He trains our mind. Now, I think that Donald Trump will not be reelected in 2020. We're going to get a Democrat. And I think Hillary Clinton's going to run again. I think that because they have sowed this convention with 20 some odd candidates, they're kind of falling out now. There's none of those that are even going to come close to a majority. I think we're going to have a hung Democratic convention. Nobody will have a majority, and who will come to the rescue? Hillary Clinton. She's on the talk show circuit. She's wrote a book called Gutsy Women. By implication, that means I'm gutsy, right? She's running for president. She didn't throw her hat in the ring in November because that would have put her into the primaries. And I don't think she wants a defeat to her name. So I think she's going to wait until there's a hung convention and then, while the rest of them shoot themselves in the foot. But I can tell you this, none of the Democrats currently running for president can beat Donald Trump. So they're not going to run any of those people. They're all too much a radical socialist. I mean, Medicare for all, $93 trillion. Who are you kidding? Even Joe Biden knows that that's not going to fly with the American people. There's just not enough money to pay for those Green New Deal promises, which came out, by the way, in 2019. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to have a Democratic president. Think what that's going to mean to have a Democrat in the House, a Democratic in the White House, Democratic control of the House of Representatives, and maybe lesser control of the Senate, or maybe Democratic control. You'll see gun control legislation like you've never seen before. And it's just frightening to think of what can happen. So I'm not saying you don't vote for Donald Trump. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump just because it's the lesser of two evils, and you got to stop the Democrats. But there's a downside too, because the longer Donald Trump is in office, the more time we have where no true principled leader can rise to replace him in the movement. And by the time, if he's in till 2024, I can tell you, the Democrats will come back with a vengeance and will never win anything again, ever again. And that may happen in 2020. So I'm trying to tell you, you need to prepare for the takedown. And I know you don't want to hear that. I know that hope rings eternal. But believe me, you need to be careful that we're not going to win back our liberty as a nation. And that doesn't mean that we're going to lose it entirely. There will always be pockets of liberty the Lord will allow to exist. And one of those will be in Utah, despite the mainstream control of this state. In rural areas, it's still very, very conservative. And that's why I wrote the book Strategic Relocation, even for Utahns. And that's why I moved to central Utah and got out of Utah Valley, just getting too liberal and control. That doesn't mean you stop fighting, by the way. What Lowell is talking about, fighting this council thing, but these people are going to overwhelm us eventually. They're going to get their way. We have to fight it so that we can hold them accountable before the judgment bar. That's part of the reason. We also have to keep fighting because we need to make sure that we convert as many of the younger generation as we can. They're getting inundated in public schools and BYU with leftist, socialist garbage. And you need to take responsibility in the home to teach your children. And I know they're resistant. If they've grown up in the public schools or in universities, they're now resistant. They think they know more than you. So you got to get educated yourself. You got to have the facts. That's why I recommend, if you're so inclined, to take my World Affairs Brief. I go to a lot of effort each week to tell you what's really going on in the country, especially from the deep state perspective. And there's not many children or teenagers, if you can get them to read the briefs, they can come away still being liberal, because I've got the goods on them. And it really works. You can get a free copy of the World Affairs Brief just by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. Now, I also have another career, as Lowell said in my introduction. I've been involved in preparedness. I'm one of the pioneers in the preparedness movement. And why am I to do that? Because I've known for a long time this isn't going to end well. And so I've been preparing I'm not a hypocrite. I live what I say. I'm preparing. In fact, I'm doing a whole new retreat system in southern Utah because the one that was too close to Utah County became untenable. I think there's going to be famine someday. You try growing a garden in a suburban area and see how long those tomatoes last. They'll be picked clean before they're ripe. That's the problem with living in a high density. Now, you can't all move out like I did. You've got jobs and you've got other types of things. But those of you who can ought to be thinking about moving to areas where you can grow a garden without hordes of people stealing your food. Those of you who can't leave ought to be thinking a retreat strategy. That's why I wrote the book, Strategic Relocation, and has all kinds of maps and colored pictures about the various threats, nuclear threats in the country. Every state, I talk about what the land use is, et cetera, where are the best areas within the states and the regions. It's very, very comprehensive, and all of the books that I have are on steep discounts here today just for being here. This is a booklet I've got, 10 Packs for Survival. It's about 10 areas of storage, the basic things to get. And one of the best things about this booklet is the barter list in the back, things to store for barter and trade, which is worth the price of itself. This is the High Security Shelter book, co-authored with my son Andrew, a structural engineer. And this is the cheapest alternative for everyone to get a safe room if you have an existing basement. In the bigger book, The Secure Home, it talks about everything from remodeling to new construction. It's 700 pages thick. But for most people, this is the cheapest alternative because you can do it yourself, and for probably less than $3,000 or $4,000. As I've said before in my former speeches, everyone needs to prepare also to hide people, because in World War III, the good people are going to be the Jews of World War III. And the government's taking names and making lists, and that's what Google spying is all about. That's what Facebook spying is, to find out who's conservative. That's why they put out disinformation like the government buying 9 billion bullets or 9mm bullets. It wasn't true, but they wanted to see what conservatives threw the message around, and they were tracking you and putting you on lists. So you got to be very careful about getting caught up in these waves of sharing things. My big magnum opus is The Secure Home. This is the big book that covers everything in preparedness. It has a huge appendix about all of the hard-to-find supplies and things. And by the way, I might say in the World Affairs Brief, every week my son Andrew writes a preparedness tip, and they are some of the most popular things in the brief. And so that's what I have to offer: information about how to prepare, as well as what's going on with the world and the deep state. It's a labor of love for me, and even though it's disturbing, I feel I'm doing the best I can to help people become awake and prepared. I will now take some questions from you. Yes, sir.
If we get a Bloomberg or a Hillary elected president, we're not going to last more than 2 years.
No, that's not true. The reason that they don't want to have a backlash. That's the only reason why they don't assassinate Donald Trump, by the way. They don't want to make a martyr out of him. It would boost, everyone know that would be unfair. They won't move as fast as you think. Remember, they'll move slowly, but you'll start to see more guns. You'll start with universal registration, background checks, red flag laws will come, and all that stuff will happen. But remember, they're going to wait till the war comes. Once war comes, they can justify everything. They're already surveilling everything. They can start locking people up. They've got NDA, indefinite detention. The first indefinite detention was under Donald Trump. He didn't know about it, of course, and there may be others, but because this is secret. But you're going to find out when people start to disappear. When Alex Jones disappears, I'll be watching my back, and because I'm not as big as Alex Jones, but I'm on his show enough that they know I exist. And anyway, we have to be careful. We have to be prepared to hide one another. Do you see? If you've read the book Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place, You got to realize it's hard to build those types of things when you got Nazi surveillance going around. So remember, having a safe room, which gives you fallout protection, because even though we won't be necessarily, there are a couple of nuclear targets here. Hill Air Force Base, a major nuclear target. You got the MX missile components stored at Hill Air Force. You got the F-35s there, so it's going to be hit. If the wind's blowing from the northwest, Salt Lake City is going to get blanketed with fallout. Fallout is survivable. It's not the end of the world. Just get a shelter, get some concrete overhead so that you can survive that, and you'll do fine. Yes, ma'am. In the back.
What's the first thing first place you'd send people to try and get their kids out of public school to give them facts?
What's the first place I would send them for what?
To get out of the public school system, what facts would you send them to?
Facts? Well, you know, it's a complex decision. It's a great sacrifice to homeschool, I know, because we've done it. Part of the problem with homeschooling is if your kids are in public schools and are already hooked on peer pressure, you got a real battle on your hands because they think they can't live without their friends. And they can, actually. One of the things that we found with our children is that they were much, much better at discussing things with adults than public school kids. Public school kids can't talk to a 15-year-old if they're 14, you know? They're not in my age group. But our kids could talk with adults, look them straight in the face, shake their hands, et cetera, and they were surprised. Those kinds of arguments are things that you don't have. Now, we have, my wife and I put out a booklet. It's not online, but it's by email, called the Homeschooling Manual on what we did in terms of general principles of homeschooling. If you want a free copy of that, you can email me at editor@World Affairs Brief, and I'd be happy to send that to you. But you need to get a handle on discipline in the children if you're going to run a good homeschool. If your kids aren't good at listening to conscience, because you can't teach all of them at the same time, especially different age groups. And so if you haven't got good self-control skills in your kids, they're going to run right over it, and it's going to be a bedlam in homeschooling. So the first thing you do is learn to get self-discipline, teach them about listening to the signals of conscience, discipline according to conscience. Not because Dad said so, because didn't you feel nervous about that before you did that? Because every time they make a mistake, there's a nervous feeling. And if they didn't feel it, you're not listening close enough. Or you're running off so quickly that you're not checking to see if there's a nervous feeling. Anyway, there's no real simplest way where you can go, but I can tell you this, there's all kinds of online resources available to homeschooling. It's much easier than it was. Now, some of it's junk, especially reading programs and junk math and modern math type of things. You know, Saxon math is still the best that there is out there, but you've got to learn to be discerning. And the principles we put out in our homeschooling manual will help guide you to judging, you know, the ways to avoid the traps in it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what information do you have on Gene Epstein? Did he kill himself? And if not, or if not, then who killed him and what was the motive?
Who killed who?
Or sorry, Gene Epstein?
Oh, Jeffrey Epstein, yeah. He was definitely murdered. And the reason is he was going to go on trial, and the FBI had already, and so had the police in Florida, already captured through his residence all of the blackmail videotapes that he had, showing all the important people having sex and pedophilia and other things. So naturally, that stuff would have come out had he gone to trial. The deep state could not allow him to go to trial. He just knew too much about those things. Who killed him? Nobody knows, but I'll tell you this, they edited the tapes. When Bill Barr says, I've looked at the tapes, and nobody went into a cell, meaning the guards lied, they didn't check on him. No. They edited the tapes so it didn't show who went into the cell to kill him. That's what Bill Barr wasn't saying. This is a typical deep state cover-up. And Ghislaine Maxwell, by the way, is being given month after month of delay with the lawyers because they're just trying to find ways to keep from prosecuting her. But you'll never see the light of day, those tape recordings of the big wigs, Prince Andrew and the rest of them, having sex with underage people, will never see the light of day. And they don't need to, by the way. These aren't done because they say, now we've got you trapped in your blackmail. These people are predictable deep staters. They just want it just in case they get cold feet someday. And that's why Epstein got all this money coming in. He wasn't a trader on Wall Street. None of the hedge fund traders said they ever dealt with Jeffrey Epstein. How could he be dealing in billions of dollars if none of the traders knew? It's because people were voluntarily throwing in a lot of money into him because he was the deep state pleasure king. And we get our pleasure and we pay, you know. Yes, sir.
What do you have to say about how Hong Kong will play out and what lessons we should be learning?
This is a very interesting case because China wants to do a Tiananmen Square there, wants to clamp down and get rid of these things. But what they've done is something they have infiltrated the protest movement in Hong Kong with violent-prone people who are communists. Those are the ones that are burning businesses and breaking glass, et cetera, so that they discredit the credit movement. Because you see, with Donald Trump's, and I don't agree with the tariffs things, but his trade pressure with China, they can't afford to clamp down on Hong Kong right now, lest the world really say Donald Trump was right, we need to cut off trade with China. So I don't think they're going to do it. They may still someday, but right now they're trying to discredit the movement, make people tired of the destruction, and they're doing it by agent provocateurs. By the way, the U.S. is doing that. Talking about interference in elections. They put agent provocateurs in Iran, in Iraq, and in Lebanon. All those riots going on in those three countries are done by Western-backed paid agent provocateurs that are, in fact, even the Iranians said the first 100 people that were shot there were not shot by our security force. And there was just some other agents in the country that were shooting the people in order to create the hatred against the government that Iran is having to deal with. Now, Iran is not a good government. I'm not defending Iran, their ayatollahs, et cetera, but they're not guilty of what the U.S. and the U.S. has done 3 false flags with Israel against Iran, the tanker attacks and the attack on the Saudi refinery. None of that was by Iran. The U.S. has a ring of Aegis destroyers around Saudi Arabia. They would have seen any aircraft or drones coming from Iran, and they have no radar tapes of that. They're just making that up. So there's still going to be a war with Iran. I think that they're going to bloody American troops somewhere in the area and blame it on Iran, and that will trigger Donald Trump to go to war with Iran.
Alex Jones interviewed Charles Skousen, who started the Russia Insider, and he said that there are more Christian churches being built in Russia than any other country in the world.
It's not true. Except for the fact that they are communist-run churches. Remember, the communists went underground, but the communists have always controlled the Russian Orthodox Church. Vladimir Putin is portraying himself as a great Christian and because he's building on these churches, but he's persecuting Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, every other evangelical, and the communists have always run the establishment churches in Russia. So this is not religious freedom. It's just a sham.
I'm going to go back in history. JFK. I've seen a tape of the unretouched Zapruder film where it shows William Greer, the driver of the car, swung around, shot JFK or killing shot in his throat. Why is that not seen more often than what Bill Cooper was showing 20 years ago?
I know, it's because of the clamp down on the media. And it gets...
Greer did give the killing shot?
No, not the killing shot. It was one of the shots from the front was great, but there were shots from the grassy knoll. We have the confessed mafia hitman who said he fired the shot from the grassy knoll. We know it hit the head. There was also a hole in the throat. That may have been Greer's shot. And that was removed by the doctors at Bethesda before the body got to, the Army Medical Center. Before the body got to Bethesda, the doctor said, hey, this body's already been autopsied. And so there's a lot of things about the JFK assassination, but...
I was just wondering what you know about the lost $21 trillion that was classified by the government, and
that's what this secret slush funding money that's gone to, I think, secret weapon systems. For example, General Mattis, after he was relieved as defense secretary, spoke at I think it was the Charles Schwab conference, and he said, off the record, he said, you would be shocked if you knew how much money was being thrown into space by our government that isn't in the budget. Now, I think what they're doing, because as I've told you before, our government, because of Presidential Decision Directive 60 of 1997, is going to absorb a nuclear first strike. So they have an excuse to say our military is decapitated and we must join a militarized global government to survive. But they're not going to do that if they don't intend to have some way of winning after you absorb a nuclear first strike. And that's not cities per se, but military targets, they'll absorb that. They know the Russians and Chinese want to blackmail the West into submission after striking the military. They don't want to hit cities and destroy the goose that lays the golden egg. I think the U.S. is building space-based weapon systems, anti-missile systems, so that after they absorb a nuclear first strike, they can say, we're not going to accept your blackmail, and we're going to move forward, and they'll be able to stop any further missiles from coming in at cities to blunt any further attack. It's an ingenious strategy, but I think that's where the trillions of dollars are going.
That's funding the state.
Yeah, it's funding the space weapon systems, which I think are being built. Yes, sir.
With all the talk of all the darkness and corruption in our government, are there any good people left? Because it seems like we should have been taken long ago.
Yeah, there are some good people, but remember, they can't do anything because once you start to see, air, and call it out, you're called a whistleblower anymore. You're suppressed. The only whistleblowers that aren't suppressed are the ones the Democrats want to testify. But anybody who works in government or the military and knows you raise your head up and start to protest policy and stuff, you get smacked down hard. Choice is you resign, like I did, or you be silent, or go along, or become corrupted. It's really sad. Yes, sir.
Do you think there'd be EMP strike before this nuclear strike?
Yes, about 15 minutes before. EMP strike about 15 minutes before. So it's essentially simultaneously, but it softens up the country so they can't react as well to the actual strike. But I think it's going to be a 1-2 punch. Remember, only Russia and China can do an EMP strike. It takes 6 to 8 high-altitude weapons to blanket this grid, not one. Forget about Iran, forget about North Korea. It takes 6 or to 8. So only Russia and China can do it. It'll be a 1-2 punch, in my opinion. Yes, ma'am.
About Romney. You mentioned Mike David shouldn't say anything about Romney.
Romney is bending over backwards to please the establishment in every way he can. He's not a conspirator. They don't let people who are faithful to their wives into the dark. But he doesn't need to be a knowing conspirator. He's bending so far backwards to please them that he might as well be one, but he isn't. So he's not guilty of that, but he is guilty of blindness, willful blindness, so that because he does not want to know what would make him be obviously a hypocrite. But I have very little respect for Mitt Romney. Yes, sir.
At one time, Mr. Romney and the youngest Bush son had a big meeting at his house on holiday for 2 hours. And there are some rumors out that they're quite close. And I question really the integrity of Mr. Romney.
Well, I think there's some real problems with principle, but you want to remember that he's getting a lot of pats on the back from high leadership in this state and church that you're doing the right thing. They like getting along with the world. And so he feels justice. So does Jeff Flake. And that's why they were for illegal immigration. That's why they were for anti-discrimination laws. And that's why they're for, they don't see any danger in the New World Order. It's a real problem where members of our church who are in high political position are succumbing to the world and not fighting the world. It's a real problem. One more question over here.
So what strategy do you recommend when we get to gun registration and later gun confiscation?
Yeah, don't register and don't give up the weapons.
The church will tell you to. You do. They'll tell you to.
Yeah, they will tell you to comply with the law, but the church does not comply with law. They take illegal aliens and give temple recommends to them who are in the country. They send them on missions. So don't tell me they obey the law. Yes, sir.
I find it hard to believe that Donald Trump doesn't understand that he's surrounded by deep state. For example, Wilbur Ross. To me, that's just a comment. I can't believe that he doesn't understand understand this. I think he owes these people. And so he has to go along with some of the things that they're telling. And the second thing is, the global economy is sitting on a powder keg here. And I don't believe we have that much time left before this thing blows. This could be.
You'd be surprised how much they can still flood overnight. They haven't even come close to hyperinflation yet. They can flood a lot more. They have been bailing out the big banks in Wall Street to the tune of $100 billion a day in repo agreements. So don't tell me they can't keep this thing afloat. Mark my words, why should they get the blame for the economy coming down on their ears? And they would get the blame, Federal Reserve and everyone else, when they can wait for war and then war covers it all. It's the war that did it. And the war will justify a new global currency, controlled by them still. And they can wipe away the debt by this. You see, this is the perfect solution. And that's why the globalists have always had war as a solution. World War I, World War II, and now World War III. It's coming, I'll tell you.
So on that point, a few years ago, I heard you say that the war was about 10 years out, so it's always 10.
And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why I've changed. It's because Russia and China are not ready yet. Now remember, the globalists can't start this war. They've got to wait for Russia and China. And the U.S. keeps building sophisticated weapons. Russia and China are now having hypersonic weapons. The U.S. is trying to counter hypersonic weapons. This postpones it. All I have predicted is the window of opportunity, meaning when do I think Russia and China will be sufficiently ready and confident? And that keeps moving out as situation changes. I don't ever mean to predict, because I don't know. We're dealing with multiple conspiracies here of when it's going to happen. All I'm saying is I don't think they're going to be ready until the latter half of this decade and probably toward the end. Even the Pentagon says Russia and China aren't going to weapons production peak till about 2028 or 29, they say. So that's my feeling. I'm not trying to make a definitive prediction, but I'm just saying thank the Lord if you have a little more time. Okay, don't relax. Remember, it takes time to prepare. We're out of time. It's 9 o'clock, and it's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.